The umbrella had been waiting in the cafe for 9 years, not hanging neatly, not forgotten in a dusty corner, not hidden away in a back room where lost things slowly became less lost and more abandoned. It stood beside the door in a tall brass umbrella stand, its curved wooden handle turned toward the entrance, as if ready for a hand that had promised to return. Every rainy night, people noticed it. A dark blue umbrella, old but not broken, elegant but not expensive. The kind of object that seemed to belong to someone careful, someone who did not usually forget things. And that was what made it strange, because in 9 years, no one ever came back for it. The cafe was called the Sparrow Rain. It sat on the corner of a narrow street where the buildings leaned close together and the pavement shone beautifully whenever the weather turned. It was small, warm, and quietly loved by the people who knew how to find it. There were 6 tables inside, a counter made of dark wood, a window seat that looked out toward the street lamp, and near the door, beneath a row of coat hooks, the brass umbrella stand. Most umbrellas came and went. Cheap black ones, bright red ones, clear plastic ones with bent ribs, children's umbrellas shaped like animals, business umbrellas left behind in a hurry and claimed 2 days later by embarrassed owners. But the dark blue umbrella stayed, season after season, storm after storm. It had become part of the cafe, like the old clock above the counter, like the smell of cinnamon in winter, like the soft bell that rang when the door opened. Customers asked about it sometimes. Someone forget that? The owner would smile faintly. A long time ago. Did they ever come back? No. Why keep it? And here the owner would pause. Not long. Just enough for the question to become heavier than it sounded. Because it looks like it's still waiting. People usually laughed softly at that, but not unkindly. The cafe was the kind of place where even practical people felt less practical after dark. For most of those 9 years, the cafe had belonged to a woman named Beatrice Vale. Everyone called her Bae. She had silver hair, warm hands, and the calm authority of someone who knew how to make soup without measuring anything. Bea opened the cafe at 7 each morning and closed it at 10 every night, except when it rained. When it rained, she stayed open 15 minutes longer. No one knew why, at least not at first. She would wipe the counter, stack the cups, turn most of the lights down, and leave one lamp burning beside the front window. Then she would look toward the door, always toward the door, as if listening for footsteps beneath the rain. The dark blue umbrella stood beside her, patient and silent. When Bea grew too tired to run the cafe alone, her niece Clara came to help. Clara arrived in early October with 2 suitcases, a careful smile, and the kind of exhaustion that did not come from travel. She was 34 and had spent the previous 8 years working in an office where no one noticed if she was unhappy as long as she answered emails politely and on time. Bea noticed immediately. That was the trouble with aunts who loved you before you learned how to hide. You look like someone who has been apologizing for breathing, Bea said on Clara's first evening. Clara laughed because she did not know what else to do. I'm fine. Bea placed a cup of tea in front of her. No, you're functional. People confuse the two. Clara looked away. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the cafe windows. The lamp near the door glowed gold, and the dark blue umbrella stood in its brass stand, waiting. Clara noticed it on her second night. Whose umbrella is that? Bea was arranging clean spoons behind the counter. Someone's. Clara turned toward her. That's mysterious. It's old. Old things can be mysterious. Bee smiled but did not answer. Clara stepped closer to the umbrella. It was beautiful in a quiet way. The fabric had faded slightly along the folds. The wooden handle was smooth from use. A thin silver band near the top carried initials scratched so lightly they were almost invisible. E.M. Did they forget it? Clara asked. Yes. When? Bee continued arranging spoons. 9 years ago. Clara looked back sharply. 9 years? Yes. And you still keep it by the door? Bee's hands paused. Then she said softly, some things should not be put away too soon. Clara did not understand. Not then. The first time Clara saw the stranger, it was raining hard. The kind of rain that makes the street look like an old film. Blurred lights, silver reflections, figures moving quickly beneath umbrellas. The cafe was nearly empty. 2 students sat near the back, whispering over notebooks. An old man read the newspaper by the window, though it was far too late for news. Bee had already wiped the counter twice. It was 10:07 p.m. The cafe should have closed 7 minutes earlier, but Bee had not locked the door. Clara noticed her aunt watching the street. Then the bell above the door rang. A man stepped inside. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with rain on the shoulders of his coat and no umbrella in his hand. His hair was white at the temples, and his face carried the quiet restraint of someone used to arriving places without expecting welcome. He did not approach the counter. He did not remove his coat. He stood just inside the doorway, near the brass umbrella stand. His eyes moved to the dark blue umbrella. For several seconds, he only looked at it. Bee stood very still behind the counter. Clara looked from one to the other. The man reached out, not touching the umbrella, only hovering his fingers near the curved wooden handle. Then he lowered his hand. "Still here," he said. His voice was low. Bee answered just as quietly. "Yes." The man nodded. Rain ran down the window behind him. Then he turned and left without ordering anything. The bell rang softly. The door closed. Clara waited. Bee picked up a towel and began wiping the already clean counter. "Who was that?" Clara asked. Bee did not look up. "Someone who isn't ready." "For what?" Bee's hands slowed. "To take it home." After that, Clara began watching rainy nights differently. The stranger did not come every time. Only sometimes. Always near closing. Always in rain. Always without an umbrella. He would step inside, stand near the brass stand, look at the dark blue umbrella, and leave again. Sometimes he spoke to Bee, usually only a few words. "Cold tonight." Yes. She would have hated this wind. She would. Once, Clara heard him say, "I thought maybe tonight." Bee answered, "Maybe another one." Another night he stood so long, Clara thought he might finally take the umbrella. Instead, he touched the silver band near the handle, closed his eyes briefly, and walked back into the rain. It made no sense. And yet, somehow, it made perfect sense in that cafe, where old lamps burned warmly and the rain seemed to bring back unfinished things. Clara asked again in November. They were closing after a long, wet evening. The students had gone. The chairs were turned over. Bee moved slowly now, her back troubling her more often. Clara stood beside the umbrella. "Tell me." Bee looked tired enough to be honest. So she sat at the nearest table. Clara sat across from her. Outside, the street lamp trembled in the rain. "His name is Edward," Bee said. "The man?" "Yes." "And the umbrella?" "Was his wife's." Clara looked toward the door. What happened? Bee folded her hands on the table. Her name was Miriam. The name entered the room gently. She used to come here every Thursday evening, Bee continued. Always with that umbrella if there was even a hint of rain. She said weather had a talent for embarrassing the overconfident. Clara smiled faintly. She sounds wonderful. She was difficult, Bee said, and the affection in her voice made the word beautiful. Opinionated, always late, read the ends of books first, and claimed it did not ruin anything. Clara laughed softly. Edward hated that. They came together? At first, then often, then always. Bee looked toward the window, and Clara understood that her aunt was no longer looking at the present cafe. She was looking through it. They sat there, Bee said, nodding toward the window table. Miriam by the glass. Edward with his back to the room because he said she was the only view he needed. Clara's chest tightened. What happened to her? Bee was quiet for a while. Then she said, one rainy night, she left the umbrella here. It had been February. A storm had moved through the city with hard wind and cold rain. The cafe had been crowded all evening, filled with wet coats and steaming cups. Miriam and Edward arrived late. They were in their 50s then, still carrying the ease of a marriage built from decades of small arguments and forgiveness. Miriam had cheeks flushed from the cold and a laugh that made the nearby tables smile without knowing why. She placed the dark blue umbrella in the stand by the door. Don't let me forget that, she told Bee. You always say that, Bee replied. And you always remember. They sat by the window. Edward ordered tea. Miriam ordered coffee she never finished. They spoke for nearly an hour, sometimes laughing, sometimes leaning close. Bee remembered this because grief later makes witnesses of ordinary details. At 9:40, Miriam stood. I left the letter in the car, she said. Edward frowned. What letter? The one for Nora, I told you. You told me 3 things while I was looking for my glasses. Then listen better, he smiled. She put on her coat. Stay, I'll be back before the coffee gives up. Miriam, take the umbrella. She waved him off. It's only across the street. The bell above the door rang as she left. That was the last sound Bee remembered clearly. Afterward came headlights, a horn, a terrible short silence. The kind of silence that divides life into before and after. Miriam never came back for the umbrella. Clara sat very still. Rain whispered against the glass. And Edward? She asked. He was here. Bee's voice was quiet. He saw enough. Clara closed her eyes. The umbrella stood near the door, unchanged by the story attached to it. That felt almost cruel. Objects survive what people cannot. Why doesn't he take it? Clara asked. Bee looked toward the umbrella with an expression Clara could not read. Because taking it home would mean the waiting was over. After Bee told the story, Clara found it difficult to look at the umbrella as an object. It became a pause, a held breath, a small blue witness to a moment that had never finished. She began noticing how people reacted to it. Some brushed past without seeing it. Some smiled at its old-fashioned shape. Children asked if it was magic. Lonely customers seemed to understand it instinctively and looked away before asking questions. Edward continued coming on rainy nights, but now Clara greeted him differently, not with pity. Pity would have insulted the precision of his grief. Instead, she would say, "Good evening," and let the space remain open. Sometimes he sat at the window table and ordered tea. Never coffee. Once, near Christmas, he asked Clara, "Did Bee tell you?" Clara nodded. Edward looked toward the umbrella. "She would have hated becoming a sad story," he said. Clara remembered Bee's words. She was difficult. Edward's face changed, a small smile. "Yes," he whispered. "She was." After that, he told Clara one thing about Miriam each time he came. She sang badly, but confidently. She kept birthday candles in every kitchen drawer. She believed yellow flowers were braver than red ones. She hated goodbyes at train stations because people waved too long. Piece by piece, Miriam became more than the accident, more than the umbrella, more than the rain. Clara began to understand something important. Grief makes people symbols because symbols are easier to carry. But love asks us to remember the person, the whole person. In January, Bee fell ill, not suddenly, not dramatically. Her body simply began admitting the fatigue she had been negotiating with for years. Clara took over more shifts, then all of them. The cafe became hers slowly, not through ceremony, but through repetition. Opening the door, grinding coffee, lighting the lamps, learning which chair wobbled, remembering which customers needed conversation and which needed silence. Bee still came in when she could, sitting near the counter with a blanket around her shoulders, correcting Clara's soup and pretending not to be proud. One rainy evening, Edward arrived while Bee was there. The two old friends looked at each other for a long moment. "You look terrible," Bee said. Edward removed his wet coat. "So do you." They smiled. Clara brought tea without being asked. Edward sat beside Bee. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then he said, "I dreamed she told me to stop being dramatic." Bee laughed, then coughed. "That sounds like Miriam." She said, "Edward, it is an umbrella, not a holy relic." Bee laughed again, softer this time. Edward looked toward the stand by the door. "I think she may be losing patience with me." "She always did." His smile faded. "I don't know who I am if I stop waiting." Bee reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Maybe someone who loved her well enough to begin carrying her differently. Edward looked down. Outside, rain softened the street into silver. Bee died in March. Quietly, at dawn, with Clara holding her hand and the bakery downstairs beginning its first loaves. The cafe closed for 1 week. When it reopened, flowers filled the counter. Customers came in quietly, speaking in low voices, touching Clara's arm, leaving cards she read only after midnight. On the first rainy night after the funeral, Clara almost closed at 10. She was tired, too tired for rituals that belonged to someone else. Then she looked at the umbrella and left the lamp burning beside the window. At 10:12, Edward came in. For the first time, he seemed older, not by years, by absence. He looked toward Bee's usual chair, then toward Clara. "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I." They stood in the warm cafe while rain moved over the glass. Edward placed one hand lightly on the umbrella handle. Clara held her breath. He did not take it. Not yet. Instead, he asked, "Do you know what Miriam's letter was? The one in the car?" He nodded. "No. It was for our daughter, Nora. She was pregnant then. Miriam had written advice because she said mothers always give too much advice aloud and not enough in writing." He smiled faintly. The letter survived, crumpled but readable. Clara waited. Nora keeps it framed in her kitchen. He looked at the umbrella. "I used to think this was the last thing Miriam left behind. And now?" Edward's fingers tightened slightly around the handle. Now, I think maybe it was just the last thing I refused to move. He came again the next rainy night, and the next. Each time he stood a little longer beside the umbrella. One evening in late April, Clara found a small bouquet of yellow flowers in the umbrella stand. No note. She knew. The next week, Edward brought his daughter. Nora was in her 30s now, with Miriam's sharp eyes and Edward's careful way of standing when emotion made him uncertain. She touched the umbrella gently, then laughed through tears. "I remember this," she said. "She used to open it indoors just to annoy Dad." Edward smiled. She said superstition was for people without curiosity. They sat by the window table. Clara brought tea and coffee. Nora told stories of Miriam that Edward had never heard. Mother stories, daughter stories, private kitchen stories. The kind grief often hides because everyone assumes they are the only one carrying the real person. By the end of the evening, Edward looked exhausted, but lighter. When they stood to leave, Nora touched the umbrella again. "Take it home, Dad." Edward did not answer. Nora kissed his cheek. "Not because you're done loving her, because you're allowed to stop leaving her in the rain." The words moved through the cafe quietly. Clara looked away. Some sentences deserve privacy, even when spoken in public. Edward took the umbrella home on the first warm rain of May. It happened without drama, no thunder, no grand farewell. Just a soft evening shower, the kind that made the street smell clean. He came in at 9:50, ordered tea, sat at the window table, stayed until closing. Then, as Clara wiped the counter, he stood and walked to the brass umbrella stand. For a moment, his hand rested on the curved wooden handle. "I thought it would feel like ending something," he said. Clara kept her voice gentle. "Does it?" He lifted the umbrella. It opened slightly in his hand, not fully, just enough for the dark blue fabric to breathe. "No," he whispered. "It feels like bringing her in." Clara smiled, though her eyes burned. Edward walked to the door. The bell rang softly as he opened it. Then he paused and looked back at the cafe. "At first I kept coming because she wasn't here," he said. "And then?" He looked toward Bee's empty chair, toward the window table, toward Clara. Then, because she was, he stepped into the rain, this time beneath the dark blue umbrella. After Edward took it, the brass stand looked strangely empty. Customers noticed immediately. "Where's the old umbrella?" "Gone home," Clara would say. Most accepted this with a nod, as if the answer made perfect sense. Because in that cafe, somehow, it did. For several weeks, Clara felt the absence each time she passed the door. The umbrella had been part of the room, part of Bee, part of rain itself. Then, one stormy night in June, a young woman rushed in just before closing, soaked through, laughing breathlessly. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could I wait here until it slows down?" "Of course," Clara said. The woman ordered coffee and sat near the window. When the rain softened, she stood quickly, gathered her coat, thanked Clara, and left. Only after the bell stopped ringing did Clara notice it. A small green umbrella leaning inside the brass stand. Forgotten. Clara walked over and touched the handle. For a moment, she felt Bee near her. Not as a ghost, as warmth, as memory, as habit, as the quiet instruction love leaves behind. She looked out at the rain-lit street and smiled. The cafe had not lost its waiting. It had simply made room for someone new. So Clara left the lamp burning 15 minutes longer, just in case. And beside the door, in the brass umbrella stand, the green umbrella waited. Not sadly, not desperately, but with the patient hope of all ordinary things that carry human stories without ever asking to. Because sometimes what we leave behind is not abandonment. Sometimes it is an invitation, a way for grief to become shelter, a way for love to stand near the door, ready when someone finally comes in from the rain.